Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. The call came at 3:17 in the morning, shattering the silence of my Houston apartment like a gunshot through glass. When NASA calls at that hour, someone very important is very scared about something they can't explain. In my 12 years as a geological contractor, I'd learned that emergency briefings meant the kind of discoveries that make generals lose sleep, and politicians demand immediate answers. Kaelen Idris. The voice belonged to Dr. Patricia Manning, NASA's chief of anomalous geological surveys. I'd worked under her before. Ecuador in 2018, that business in Nevada last year that we're still not allowed to discuss, and half a dozen other missions where the official reports bore little resemblance to what we actually found. Speaking, I mumbled, already reaching for the notepad I kept beside my bed. Years of chasing mysteries buried in rock and time had taught me to document everything, especially the details that seemed insignificant at first. We need you in Afghanistan. Pack for extended underground work, minimum 2 weeks. Your flight leaves in 4 hours. Afghanistan. The name hit me like a physical blow, awakening memories I'd spent years trying to suppress. My Lebanese grandmother's voice echoed across decades, telling stories she'd heard from her own grandmother about cursed kings and relics that toppled empires, tales I'd dismissed as old world superstition until I became old enough to recognize the terror that crept into her eyes whenever she spoke of distant mountains and the things buried beneath them. What's in Afghanistan that NASA cares about? I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer would change everything. Satellite imaging picked up geometric anomalies beneath Bamiyan Valley, hollow chambers that don't match any known geological formations. The electromagnetic signatures are unlike anything in our databases, and the Pentagon is asking questions we can't answer. Bamiyan Valley. My grandmother had called it the graveyard of kings, a place where ambitious men went seeking power and instead found only death. She'd told me about the treasure of Zohak, an ancient relic that could make any man a ruler, but always destroyed everything he tried to rule. Her stories painted pictures of empires that rose like wildfire, only to collapse into ash and madness, leaving nothing behind but ruins and warnings carved in dead languages. I'll need a specialized team, I said, my mind already racing through the implications. Already assembled. Dr. Vera Anselm, our top linguist, specializing in extinct Indo-Iranian languages. Jonas Mirek, field technician, with more underground experience than anyone in the program. Captain Amir Casmi, Afghan military liaison who knows the region better than our satellite maps. You'll meet them at Dulles in 3 hours. After I hung up, I sat in the darkness of my bedroom staring at the framed photograph on my nightstand. My grandmother, Fatima Idris, taken shortly before her death 3 years ago. Even in her 80s, her eyes had held secrets that seemed too heavy for one person to carry across a lifetime. If you ever find yourself in the mountains of the Hindu Kush, she'd told me during one of our last conversations, her weathered hands gripping mine with surprising strength, remember that some treasures are buried for reasons more important than their value. The earth keeps its own counsel, Habib. Sometimes the dead sleep peacefully, only because we allow them to. I'd laughed then, dismissed it as the rambling of an old woman whose mind was starting to wander between past and present. Now packing my gear in the pre-dawn darkness, her words felt less like folklore and more like prophecy. The flight to Kabul stretched across time zones and realities, each mile carrying me further from the comfortable certainty of the known world. Modern airports gave way to military checkpoints, air conditioning replaced by dust and diesel fumes, and the familiar rhythm of civilian life faded into the harsh cadence of a land that had seen too much history, absorbed too much blood, witnessed too many empires rise and fall in its ancient valleys. My teammates were waiting at Bagram Airfield, a collection of individuals who looked like they'd been handpicked by someone with a very specific and very dangerous job in mind. Dr. Vera Anselm was a thin, intense woman in her early 40s, the kind of academic who spent her life translating dead languages and excavating forgotten civilizations. Her specialty was Proto-Indo-Iranian linguistics, a field so obscure that most universities didn't even offer courses in it, but her reputation for unlocking the secrets of extinct cultures was legendary in archaeological circles. Jonas Mirek was her opposite in every conceivable way. Young, enthusiastic, and completely in love with his collection of electromagnetic scanners and ground-penetrating radar units. He joined NASA straight out of MIT with the kind of brilliant, hungry mind that saw every anomaly as a puzzle, waiting to be solved rather than a warning to be heeded. His equipment cases bore the scars of expeditions to places that didn't appear on civilian maps, and his eyes held the particular gleam of someone who'd seen things that challenged the boundaries of accepted science. Captain Amir Casmi was harder to read, a puzzle wrapped in military bearing and cultural complexity. Afghan army, probably in his late 30s, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his entire adult life in mountains that had broken stronger men than him. His English was perfect, accent-free in a way that spoke of advanced education, but there was something in his dark eyes that suggested he knew things about this mission that the rest of us didn't. The locals aren't enthusiastic about this expedition, he told us as we loaded our gear into reinforced vehicles for the overland journey to Bamiyan. His voice carried the careful neutrality of a man who'd learned to navigate between competing authorities. My grandmother's village is near the caves you want to explore. They've been telling stories about those cliffs for longer than anyone can remember. What kind of stories? Vera asked, her linguistic mind automatically cataloguing every detail that might prove useful in understanding whatever we were about to encounter. The treasure of Zohak, Casmi replied, his voice carrying a weight that made the air in the vehicle feel suddenly thick and oppressive. They say the cliffs hide a relic from the time before Islam, before Buddhism, before any of the faiths that have claimed this land over the centuries. Something that grants dominion over men but steals the soul of whoever claims it, turning love to hatred and loyalty to betrayal, with the inexorability of poison spreading through water. Jonas laughed from the front seat, adjusting the settings on one of his scanners with the casual confidence of someone who'd never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with the right technology. Superstition and folklore, probably just worried we'll find something archaeologically valuable, and the government will relocate their villages to make room for tourist sites. I caught Casemi's expression in the rearview mirror as Jonas spoke. He wasn't laughing. If anything, he looked like a man driving toward his own execution, fulfilling a duty that terrified him but which honor demanded he complete. The journey to Bamiyan took us through landscapes that seemed carved from the bones of giants, ancient and unforgiving terrain that had watched civilizations rise and fall with the dispassionate patience of geological time. Empty niches in the cliff face marked where the colossal Buddha statues had once stood, destroyed in 2001 by extremists who couldn't tolerate reminders of Afghanistan's complex spiritual heritage. Now they looked like hollow eye sockets in a massive skull, staring blindly across a valley that had witnessed more history than most continents. There, Casmi pointed to a section of cliff face that looked identical to every other section, unless you knew what to look for. Your satellite anomalies are directly behind that rockfall. The entrance has been sealed for centuries, maybe millennia. As we established our base camp in the shadow of those ancient cliffs, I began to understand why the locals avoided this place with such consistency. The silence was wrong somehow, too complete and too intentional, as if the very air was holding its breath in anticipation of something terrible, or wonderful, or both. Even the wind seemed reluctant to blow through the valley, and when it did, it carried sounds that might have been echoes of ancient voices or might have been the whispers of the restless dead. We rappelled down the cliff face as the sun began its descent. Towards the western peaks, each of us carrying enough gear to sustain a week underground if necessary. The cave entrance was hidden behind centuries of accumulated rockfall, debris that might have been natural or might have been deliberately placed by people who understood the importance of keeping certain things buried. The narrow opening exhaled air, so stale it tasted like the breath of something that had been entombed alive, waiting in darkness for the right combination of circumstances to grant it freedom. My headlamp beam cut through shadows that seemed almost solid, revealing walls covered in faded murals that told the story of this place across layers of time and civilization. The upper chambers showed clear signs of Buddhist habitation, meditation cells carved into the living rock with mathematical precision, storage areas for manuscripts and supplies, and everywhere the serene faces of enlightened beings seeking truth through inner contemplation. The artwork was extraordinary, created by monks who understood that beauty itself could be a form of prayer, a bridge between the material world and something infinitely larger. "These paintings are remarkable," Vera whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space, as if the stone itself was listening and responding to our presence. "The artistic style suggests they date from the Kushan period, 3rd or 4th century, but the preservation is almost supernatural. It's as if time moves differently down here." She was right. The murals seemed to glow with their own inner light, depicting scenes of spiritual transcendence and inner peace, with a skill that rivaled anything in the great temples of India or Tibet. Lotus blossoms opened across rock walls like frozen flowers, and the eyes of painted Buddhas followed us with expressions of infinite compassion, as if they understood something about our mission that we ourselves didn't yet comprehend. But as we moved deeper into the tunnel system, following passages that seemed to spiral down toward the Earth's heart in patterns that defied conventional engineering, the artwork began to change. The Buddhist imagery gave way to older paintings, darker themes that spoke of very different purposes for these underground chambers. Golden crowns dripping with what looked suspiciously like blood, rendered in pigments that shouldn't have survived centuries of humidity and time. Armies of men prostrating themselves before shadowy figures whose faces were deliberately obscured, as if the artists understood that some things were too dangerous to depict with clarity. Scenes of conquest and submission that spoke not of spiritual enlightenment but of temporal power, and the terrible price it demanded from those who sought it. "The script is changing too," Vera noted, running her fingers along carved symbols that seemed to shift and dance in our flashlight beams. Sanskrit in the upper levels, which makes perfect sense for Buddhist monks. But down here, it's Bactrian, and some of these lower passages show Sogdian inscriptions. This place has been continuously occupied for over 1,000 years, maybe longer. Jonas's sophisticated equipment started malfunctioning around the 4th level down, giving readings that violated everything he thought he knew about electromagnetic fields and geological structures. His scanner, a piece of technology so advanced that NASA guarded its specifications like military secrets, began displaying patterns that made him frown and tap the screen with increasing frustration. "This can't be right," he muttered, holding the scanner at different angles as if that might somehow correct whatever error was causing the anomalous readings. "It's detecting some kind of localized electromagnetic field, but the signature doesn't match anything in our databases. It's almost like there's a massive electrical system down here, something generating power from sources I can't identify. The air grew thicker as we descended, taking on a metallic taste that coated the back of our throats and made our teeth ache with each breath. Strange acoustics transformed the cave system into a vast musical instrument, amplifying some sounds while deadening others, creating an auditory landscape where our footsteps echoed like gunshots, while our voices seemed muffled and distant. More than once I could have sworn I heard conversations echoing from passages we hadn't yet explored, discussions in languages that predated recorded history, voices that spoke with the authority of kings and the desperation of the damned. When we stopped to investigate, we found only empty stone and shadows that seemed to move independently of our light sources. "This place makes me deeply uneasy," Vera admitted as we paused to rest and recalibrate our increasingly unreliable equipment. The linguistic evidence suggests continuous habitation across multiple civilizations, but there's something fundamentally wrong with the chronology. Some of these inscriptions predate the Buddhist period by centuries, but they're carved over the Buddhist artwork, not under it. It's as if history itself is layered incorrectly down here. Casmi had been growing quieter with each level we descended, his usual military bearing gradually replaced by something that looked increasingly like existential dread. When we stopped to eat our evening meal in what had once been a Buddhist meditation chamber, he finally broke his increasingly troubled silence. "My family has been guardians of secrets about this place for 20 generations, he said, his voice barely above a whisper that somehow carried more weight than a shout. Stories passed down from father to son, mother to daughter, always with the same warning: these are not natural caves. They are prisons, built by ancient Persian engineers to contain something too dangerous to destroy and too powerful to simply ignore." "Contain what?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer and dreaded hearing it confirmed. "The crown that makes kings of slaves and enemies of friends. The relic that Darius the Great's greatest architects buried here after it destroyed 3 dynasties in less than a generation. They built these chambers as both vault and trap, a maze designed to keep the curious away and the greedy contained until they could be safely forgotten by history." Jonas was already shaking his head before Casmi finished speaking, his scientific training rejecting explanations that couldn't be measured and quantified. "Come on, Captain, we're scientists, not treasure hunters, chasing folklore and superstition. Whatever your ancestors buried down here, it's probably just some ceremonial headdress that accumulated mythology over the centuries. People always build elaborate legends around things they don't understand." But even as he spoke these rational words, Jonas's scanner was picking up stronger signals with each step we took deeper into the mountain, electromagnetic anomalies that seemed to be drawing us forward, like a technological divining rod pointing toward whatever was waiting in the darkness below. We found the sealed chamber on the deepest level we could access without specialized climbing equipment, hidden behind a collapsed wall that might have been the result of deliberate engineering or natural geological forces working over centuries. Jonas used a small-shaped charge to clear the debris, the explosion echoing through the tunnel system like the heartbeat of something vast and patient. When the dust settled and our lights penetrated the space beyond, we found ourselves looking at a chamber that had been sealed from the world since before the birth of Christ. The air that rushed out carried scents of bitumen and ancient incense, with an underlying metallic odour that made my stomach clench and my grandmother's warnings echo in my memory, like prophecies finally coming true. The chamber itself was circular, carved with mathematical precision that suggested either advanced engineering knowledge or access to tools that shouldn't have existed in the ancient world. The walls were covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, not because they were physically bright, but because they seemed to exist in more dimensions than human eyes were designed to process. At the center of this impossible space sat a stone chest, its surface covered in inscriptions that seemed to move and writhe in our shifting light beams. The lid was sealed with black bitumen that had hardened over millennia, to the consistency of volcanic glass, and the entire structure radiated an aura of age and patient malevolence that made our skin crawl with primal recognition of danger. "Don't touch it," Casmi commanded, with the authority of someone whose family had died to keep this moment from happening. But Jonas was already circling the chest with his scanner, extended, completely absorbed in readings that challenged everything he thought he knew about physics and archaeology. "It's incredible," he breathed, his voice filled with the kind of wonder that scientists feel when they encounter something that redefines the boundaries of the possible. "It's giving off electromagnetic pulses, low level but definitely measurable. Whatever's inside is either naturally radioactive or generating its own energy field through some mechanism I can't begin to understand." Veira was working on translating the symbols carved into the chest's surface, her expertise in dead languages allowing her to piece together warnings that had been written in multiple scripts across different time periods. Her voice grew increasingly troubled as she worked through inscriptions that seemed to tell the same story in dozens of extinct tongues. "He who wears it conquers his foes, but becomes the enemy of all mankind," she read, her translation carrying the weight of prophecy. "That which grants dominion over others steals dominion over oneself. Beware the crown that makes kings of slaves and turns love to hatred in the space of a single heartbeat." "A crown," I said, feeling that familiar chill run down my spine like ice water in my veins. "The same crown your family has been guarding against for 20 generations. "The Serpent-Crown of Zohak," Casmi confirmed, his voice heavy with the weight of inherited responsibility that had shaped his entire bloodline. "Persian legend says it was forged by Ahriman himself, the demon of lies and discord who opposes everything good in creation. King Zohak wore it and became a monster. Serpents grew from his shoulders that fed on human brains, and everyone he had once loved became his mortal enemy. But the crown came first. It was the crown that transformed a man into something that could no longer love or trust or show mercy to any living thing." Jonas was already working at the bitumen seal with a heated knife, his academic excitement overriding any concerns about ancient curses or family legends that couldn't be verified through peer review. "This is potentially the archaeological discovery of the century," he said, sweat beading on his forehead as he carefully separated the hardened sealant from the stone. "Whatever civilization created this understood metallurgy and engineering principles that we're only rediscovering today. The electromagnetic signature alone could revolutionize our understanding of ancient technology and maybe even physics itself." "Jonas, stop," I said, my grandmother's warning screaming in my memory like air raid sirens. "Some things are buried for reasons more important than academic curiosity." But the seal was already cracking, splitting along lines of weakness that had been waiting centuries for the right combination of heat and pressure to activate them. The lid came away with a sound like breaking bones, releasing air that had been trapped since the time of Christ's birth into a world that had forgotten why such precautions were necessary. Inside the chest, nestled in silk that crumbled to powder at our touch, lay the most beautiful and terrible object I had ever seen or ever hope to see again. The Serpent-Crown of Zohak was a jagged golden circlet inlaid with lapis lazuli that seemed to glow with its own inner light, each facet and curve designed to catch and hold the eye while promising power beyond mortal comprehension. Even in the harsh LED illumination of our headlamps, it pulsed with malevolent beauty that made our hearts race and our minds fill with sudden visions of dominance and control. The craftsmanship was flawless, representing techniques that shouldn't have existed until the Renaissance, but there was something fundamentally wrong with its geometry, as if it had been designed according to mathematical principles that human minds weren't meant to grasp. "My God," Veira breathed, her linguistic training momentarily overwhelmed by the sheer presence of the artifact. "It's extraordinary." The metalwork represents a level of sophistication that challenges everything we think we know about ancient civilizations. But there's something else, something I can't quite identify. The proportions are wrong somehow, as if it wasn't made for human heads. She was right, though I couldn't articulate why until much later. Looking at the crown made something deep in my brain recoil, in primal terror, as if the sight of it was triggering ancestral memories of danger that had been encoded in our species' genetic heritage. It was beautiful in the way that poisonous snakes are beautiful, perfect, and deadly, and absolutely not meant for human contact. Jonas reached for it despite all our warnings, his eyes reflecting the crown's golden gleam with an intensity that should have been our first clear warning of what was about to happen. His fingers trembled as they approached the metal, not with fear but with anticipation, as if he was finally about to touch something he'd been searching for his entire life without realizing it. "Just for a moment," he said, his voice already carrying harmonics that human vocal cords shouldn't have been able to produce. "Just to examine it properly, to understand what they were truly capable of creating. Think of what we could learn from this, what it could teach us about consciousness and power, and the nature of authority itself." The moment his skin made contact with the metal, the temperature in the chamber dropped by at least 15 degrees, and every piece of electronic equipment we carried began displaying readings that violated the laws of physics. But instead of breaking down, our devices began showing symbols that matched the inscriptions on the chest, as if the crown was somehow communicating with our technology in ways we couldn't begin to understand. "We need to leave," I said, every instinct I'd developed in 12 years of geological work screaming that we had just made a catastrophic mistake. Now, before whatever's happening here goes any further. But Jonas was already cradling the crown like a parent holding a newborn child. His expression transformed by an obsession so complete it erased every other consideration from his consciousness. The scientific curiosity that had defined his personality was being burned away by something darker and far more ancient, something that had been waiting in that golden metal for centuries. That night, back in our temporary camp in the cave's upper chambers, Jonas began talking in his sleep. Not the usual mumbled nonsense of dreams, but clear, distinct names, spoken with a hatred so pure and concentrated it seemed to poison the very air around his sleeping bag. "David Kellerman," he snarled, his voice barely recognizable as belonging to the enthusiastic young scientist we'd known just hours before. Lying, stealing piece of human garbage. Took credit for my research, got the promotion that should have been mine. Hope he dies screaming. I knew that name. David had been Jonas's research partner at MIT before a bitter falling out over patent rights and academic credit. They'd had a professional disagreement, nothing more, but I'd never heard Jonas express anything stronger than mild annoyance about the situation. "Richard Westbrook," Jonas continued, his sleeping voice filled with venom that seemed to seep into the stone walls around us. "Passed me over for promotion 3 times. Said I wasn't ready for leadership responsibilities. We'll see who's ready when his comfortable little world comes crashing down around his ears." The names kept coming, each delivered like a curse, with hatred that grew stronger and more focused with every utterance. Colleagues who'd crossed him in minor ways, supervisors who'd criticized his work constructively, classmates who'd outperformed him in graduate school, people I'd never heard him mention, grievances I'd never suspected he harbored, all pouring out in a litany of resentment and rage that seemed to be drawing power from some inexhaustible source of malice. When our satellite phone crackled to life the next morning, the news that came through the static made my blood freeze in my veins, like winter arriving without warning. "This is Dr. Manning from Houston Control," the familiar voice said, distorted by distance and atmospheric interference, but unmistakably urgent. "We need to speak with Jonas Mirek immediately. There's been a serious incident involving one of his former colleagues." David Kellerman had died the night before, in what investigators were calling the most bizarre accident in MIT's history. Electrocuted when multiple independent safety systems failed simultaneously, found burned beyond recognition in a locked laboratory with no signs of equipment malfunction, sabotage, or any rational explanation for how such a thing could have occurred. Jonas listened to the news with a strange smile playing at the corners of his mouth, his fingers never leaving the crown's surface despite our repeated suggestions that he secure it properly in its original chest. When Dr. Manning asked how he was handling the news of his former partner's death, Jonas's response chilled me to the bone. "Tragic," he said, but there was no tragedy in his voice, only satisfaction. And underneath that, something that sounded almost like hunger. David always was careless with electrical equipment. I told him years ago that his safety protocols were inadequate, but he never listened. Some people have to learn lessons the hard way. Over the next 48 hours, every single name Jonas had spoken in his sleep died under circumstances that defied rational explanation. Richard Westbrook fell down the stairs of his Chicago apartment building, his neck twisted at an angle that suggested he'd been thrown rather than simply fallen. Sarah Channing, a classmate from graduate school, choked to death on her dinner at an upscale Boston restaurant, the food somehow turning solid in her throat despite being liquid when she swallowed it. Mark Torres was found beaten to death in his locked office by what appeared to be his own awards and trophies, wielded with a force that suggested superhuman strength. The deaths made international news as investigators struggled to find connections between the victims and explanations for the impossible circumstances surrounding each tragedy. But down in the caves beneath Bamiyan Valley, stranger things were happening that no news crew would ever report because no rational person would believe them. The murals on the walls changed nightly, showing more corpses with each dawn, more scenes of violence and betrayal, rendered in pigments that glowed with their own light. Faces that looked suspiciously like Jonas's victims began appearing in the painted crowds, their eyes following us as we moved through the tunnels, their expressions frozen in moments of terror and accusation. The air grew damper and more oppressive with each passing day, thick with the smell of iron and decay that seemed to seep from the stone itself. Our equipment continued malfunctioning in ways that made no technical sense. Batteries that drained completely in minutes despite showing full charges. Compasses that spun wildly before pointing toward the chamber where the crown waited. And Jonas's beloved scanners giving readings that seemed to cause physical pain when we tried to interpret them. "The crown is doing this," Casmi insisted, during one of our increasingly tense planning sessions. "It feeds on hatred and resentment, magnifies every grievance until there's nothing left but enemies and the desire for revenge. Every empire that controlled Bamiyan fell the same way. The Kushans, the Ghaznavids, the Mongols under Genghis Khan himself. They all sought the crown thinking it would make them invincible rulers. Instead, it made them completely and utterly alone." Jonas laughed when we tried to explain the pattern, a sound that echoed strangely in the confined space and seemed to come from more throats than just his own. "You're all just jealous," he said, his golden eyes reflecting light that wasn't coming from any of our equipment. "NASA sent you here to steal it from me, didn't they? Turn it into some kind of weapon for the military-industrial complex. But it's mine now. It chose me, and I finally understand what it really represents." His transformation was accelerating with each passing hour. The enthusiasm and scientific curiosity that had defined his personality being systematically burned away by something darker and far more ancient. When he spoke now, his voice sometimes carried harmonics that made our bones ache, layers of sound that suggested other voices speaking in unison with his own, a chorus of long-dead kings and emperors who had worn the crown before him. What do you think it really represents? Vera asked, though I could tell from her expression that she was already beginning to suspect the truth and wish she hadn't. It's not just a crown, Jonas replied, his fingers tracing the artifact's serpentine curves with the devotion of a lover caressing skin. It's a conduit, a bridge between this world and somewhere else, somewhere older and more honest about what human nature really is underneath all the pretense. It shows you the truth about people, that beneath all the social conditioning and moral posturing, we're all enemies waiting for the right excuse to destroy each other. On the fourth night of our expedition, as winter winds howled through the valley above our underground prison, Jonas put the crown on fully. I was awakened by a sound that will haunt my nightmares until the day I die. A scream that started human, but became something else entirely, as it echoed through the cave system, bouncing off stone walls and multiplying until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The sound seemed to originate from the mountain itself, as if the earth was crying out in pain or ecstasy, or some combination of both that human language has no words to describe. Jonas was standing in the center of our camp when I struggled out of my sleeping bag. The crown fused to his skull in a way that suggested it had grown there rather than been placed by human hands. His spine arched at an angle that should have shattered vertebrae, and when he opened his mouth to scream again, the sound that emerged was layered with voices from across centuries, kings and emperors, warlords and tyrants, all speaking in perfect unison through his transformed throat. The change in our environment was immediate and horrifying in ways that violated every natural law I thought I understood. The cave walls began bleeding actual blood that ran in crimson rivers down the painted surfaces, transforming the serene Buddhist murals into scenes of carnage and betrayal that seemed to move and shift when we weren't looking directly at them. The artwork came alive in ways that challenged the fundamental nature of reality, showing battles that had never been recorded by historians, massacres carried out by men wearing the very crown that now sat upon Jonas's head. But the blood and moving paintings were nothing compared to what began emerging from the earth itself, rising from depths that might have reached the planet's molten core. Skeletal figures in rotted royal regalia, their empty eye sockets glowing with the same golden light that now emanated from Jonas's transformed features. Ancient kings and forgotten emperors, each carrying the physical marks of how the crown had ultimately destroyed them. Throats slit by trusted advisors, backs pierced by beloved sons' knives, faces bearing the claw marks of former friends transformed into mortal enemies by the crown's inexorable influence. They moved toward Jonas with jerky, puppet-like motions drawn by the crown's call to serve their cursed master once again in whatever capacity the artifact demanded. But Jonas was no longer the young scientist who had joined our expedition just days before, full of enthusiasm for discovery and academic advancement. His shoulders had begun to bulge and split along seams that followed no human anatomy, and I swear I could see something serpentine moving beneath his skin, pushing against the fabric of his shirt with a rhythm that matched his increasingly inhuman heartbeat. "We have to get out of here," Vera gasped. But when we tried to reach the upper levels and escape to the surface world, we discovered that our exit routes had been sealed by rockfall that hadn't existed just hours before. The cave system was changing around us in real time, passages shifting and sealing as if the mountain itself was alive and responding to the crown's awakening, with geological processes that operated according to will rather than physics. Sound bounced strangely off the transforming walls, carrying whispers in languages that predated recorded history, sometimes offering what sounded like advice in voices we almost recognized, other times delivering threats that made our skin crawl with the certainty that we were being hunted by something that had infinite patience and unlimited time. "There is another way," Casmi said suddenly, his military training allowing him to maintain tactical focus even as our world dissolved into nightmare around us. "The Buddhist monks who lived here, weren't just hiding from religious persecution. They were guards maintaining a spiritual seal that kept the crown's power contained within these chambers, and beneath their meditation rooms, the ancient Persians built something else. He led us deeper into the mountain, past chambers we hadn't previously explored, down passages that seemed to spiral toward the Earth's molten heart according to architectural principles that hurt to contemplate. The walls here were carved with symbols that made our eyes water and our minds recoil from comprehension, designs that suggested geometries that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space but somehow did anyway. Fire chambers, Casmi explained as we descended into air that grew hotter and more toxic with each step. The ancient Persians channeled natural gas vents to create flames that burned continuously for over 1,000 years. Sacred fires that were already ancient when Alexander the Great conquered this region and wondered at their origins. According to the legends passed down in my family, the crown was forged in primal fire, and only primal fire can unmake what was created in the Earth's heart. Behind us, we could hear Jonas following, but his footsteps no longer sounded remotely human. They were accompanied by a scraping noise that might have been claws on stone, and by the rhythmic movement of his growing skeletal army, whose bones clicked against rock with the mechanical precision of an army that had been drilling together for centuries. His voice echoed through the tunnels, sometimes speaking in Jonas's familiar tone, other times in the ancient languages of dead empires, often in harmonies that suggested multiple throats producing sound simultaneously. "You can't hide from me," he called, his words carrying harmonics that made the stone walls vibrate and small pieces of the ceiling rain down on our heads. "I am every king who ever wore this crown, every ruler who ever understood that power is the only truth that matters in a world built on lies and weakness. I am Cyrus and Darius, Genghis Khan and Timur the Lame. I am Zohak himself, risen from the depths to claim what was always rightfully mine. The world will bow before superior strength, or the world will burn in the fires of its own inadequacy." The fire chamber was a natural cavern where ancient Persian engineers had channeled underground gas vents to create flames that had burned continuously for over a millennium, fed by geological processes that dated back to the planet's formation. Some still flickered weakly in cracks in the stone, sustained by gas seepage that probably connected to reservoirs deep enough to touch the Earth's core. The air here was almost unbearably hot and thick with sulfurous compounds that made breathing difficult and clear thinking nearly impossible. "If we can get the crown into the flames," Casmi explained, his voice strained by the toxic atmosphere and the weight of ancestral responsibility, "it should break the curse and free Jonas from whatever's controlling him. But the crown won't let itself be destroyed easily. It will fight to survive, and it has an army of the dead to command." We tried to set a trap using our remaining equipment, hoping to create enough of a distraction to let one of us get close enough to Jonas to remove the crown before its transformation of him became irreversible. But when he finally appeared at the chamber's entrance, flanked by his skeletal army, and wreathed in golden light that hurt to look at directly, I realized how completely we had underestimated what we were dealing with. Jonas was no longer recognizable as anything that had ever been human. The crown had fused with his skull, growing into his flesh like golden cancer that pulsed with its own malevolent life. His shoulders had split completely open, revealing serpentine appendages that writhed and hissed with independent intelligence, their fanged mouths dripping with venom that sizzled and smoked when it hit the stone floor. His eyes were no longer human organs, but reptilian slits that glowed with inner fire, and when he smiled, his teeth had been replaced by row upon row of needle-sharp fangs designed for tearing rather than chewing. Behind him came his army of the dead, dozens of skeletal kings from across the millennia, each wearing the rotted remains of royal regalia from their respective eras and carrying weapons that had once commanded empires. They moved with deadly purpose now, no longer the jerky puppets They had been in the upper chambers, but coordinated like a military unit that had been drilling together for centuries under the command of something that understood warfare on a scale that transcended individual battles or campaigns. "You think fire can destroy what was born in the earth's heart?" Jonas spoke with a voice like grinding millstones, the words emerging from a throat that had been restructured to produce sounds no human larynx was designed to make. "I'm older than your species, older than your pathetic civilization, older than the very concepts you use to pretend you understand reality. I was already ancient when the first human learned to make fire, and I will be here long after your sun is burned out and your planet is nothing but cosmic dust drifting through empty space." The battle that followed was like something from humanity's oldest nightmares, made manifest in stone and flame. Vera tried to distract the skeletal kings with fragments of ancient Sogdian she had memorized, words of power that seemed to cause them physical pain and briefly disrupted their supernatural coordination. The dead rulers recoiled from her voice like living things touched by acid, their bone weapons clattering to the ground as they writhed in apparent agony. Casmi fought with knowledge passed down through 20 generations of guardians, using counter-rituals and protective symbols that his ancestors had died to preserve. He carved signs into the chamber walls with his combat knife, geometric patterns that seemed to create zones of safety where the crown's influence weakened, and Jonas's army couldn't fully manifest their power. But it quickly became clear that we were fighting a losing battle against forces that had been accumulating strength for millennia. Jonas had become something beyond human understanding, a conduit for malevolence that stretched back to the dawn of civilization, and his army was literally infinite. For every skeleton we managed to knock apart through desperate improvisation, 2 more emerged from the chamber floor, summoned from graveyards and battlefields across the ancient world by the crown's inexhaustible hunger for servants. The heat in the chamber was becoming unbearable, not just from the natural gas flames, but from some supernatural fire that seemed to radiate from Jonas himself. The air shimmered with energies that made our vision blur and our thoughts scatter like leaves in a hurricane. I could feel my sanity beginning to fray at the edges as I witnessed things that violated every law of physics and biology I had ever learned. That's when Casmi made the sacrifice that saved us all and changed my understanding of what human courage could accomplish in the face of absolute evil. "The crown feeds on hatred and fear," he shouted over the chaos of battle, his voice barely audible above the screams of the dead and the roar of underground flames that seemed to be growing stronger by the minute. "But love is stronger than hate, and courage is stronger than fear. My family has guarded this place for 1,000 years, and I will not be the first to fail in that sacred duty." Without hesitation, he threw himself at the monster Jonas had become, not trying to fight or destroy, but embracing him like a brother, returning from a long and terrible journey. The love in that gesture, the pure selflessness of a man willing to die for strangers in service to something greater than himself, created a moment of confusion in the crown's power that rippled through the entire chamber like a stone thrown into still water. Jonas screamed, a sound that shattered stalactites and sent his skeletal army reeling in apparent agony. The golden light that surrounded him flickered and dimmed, and the serpentine appendages that had grown from his shoulders writhed as if they were being burned by invisible fire. The crown's hold wavered, and for just an instant, I saw the real Jonas underneath the monster, terrified, horrified by what he had become, begging for forgiveness with eyes that were briefly human again. In that moment of clarity, Vera acted with the kind of courage that defines true heroes throughout history. She grabbed the crown with both hands, her skin sizzling and smoking where it made contact with the cursed metal, and with her dying strength, hurled it towards the largest flame vent in the chamber's center. "For everyone who ever loved something more than power," she gasped as the crown's malevolence burned through her flesh like acid. for everyone who chose service over dominion. But the crown didn't want to die, and its will to survive was backed by millennia of accumulated malice and the desperate hunger of something that had tasted godlike power and refused to relinquish it. Instead of being consumed by the ancient fires, the crown began to glow, with a light that outshone the sun, and made the chamber's natural flames seem like candle flickerings. By comparison, the cursed artifact pulsed with energies that warped space around it, and the flames that should have destroyed it instead spread outward in a wave that threatened to incinerate everything in the mountain's heart. The skeletal army crumbled to dust as the supernatural fires washed over them, their long servitude finally ended after centuries of unwilling bondage to the crown's will. But something far worse began to stir in the depths beneath our feet as the crown's destruction released forces that had been carefully contained for thousands of years. The earth shook with a rhythm like a massive heartbeat, each pulse stronger than the last and accompanied by sounds that suggested something unimaginably vast was moving in spaces that shouldn't have existed. Cracks opened in the chamber floor, releasing air so foul and ancient that it made our eyes stream and our lungs burn with each agonized breath. And from those cracks came a sound that will haunt me until my dying day. Laughter that was old when the pyramids were young, terrible and amused and infinitely patient. The sound of something that had been waiting for this moment across geological epochs. Zohak himself was waking up, and the crown's destruction had only freed him from the spiritual chains that had kept him dormant in the earth's depths. "Run!" Casmi gasped with his final breath, his body broken by the crown's death throes, but his spirit undefeated by the forces arrayed against him. The crown was just his anchor to the upper world, a way to influence events from his prison in the deep places. Now that it's been destroyed, he's free to rise again, and this time there will be no cage strong enough to hold him. The cave system began collapsing around us as I stumbled toward what I desperately hoped was an exit route, guided more by instinct than knowledge through passages that were transforming into something that resembled a throat more than a tunnel. Behind me, something vast and terrible was pulling itself up from depths that might reach the planet's molten core, each movement sending shockwaves through the mountain that brought down centuries of accumulated stone. I caught glimpses of it in the firelight as I fled, scales the size of medieval shields that reflected flame like polished mirrors, eyes like burning stars that seemed to see everything that had ever happened in this place, and the serpentine heads that had given the Demon King his legendary appearance. Each head was the size of a building, and they moved with intelligence that was older than human civilization, and infinitely more malevolent. Each movement of the awakening monster sent shockwaves through the mountain, bringing down passages that had been carved by human hands and sealed by human sacrifice. I made it out just as the entire cliff face came down in an avalanche that could be heard for miles, tons of rock crashing into the valley below, with a sound like the end of the world. But even as I stumbled away from the destruction on legs that could barely carry my weight, I could feel that the collapse had only postponed the inevitable, rather than prevented it. Something was still moving in the depths, something patient and eternal that could afford to wait decades or centuries for the seals to weaken enough to permit its full return to the surface world. The mountain continued to shake for hours after the collapse, tremors that followed no known seismic pattern and seemed to pulse in rhythm with something that might have been breathing. When helicopter rescue teams finally reached me the next day, I was found 3 miles from the collapse site, suffering from severe dehydration and exposure, babbling about golden crowns and serpent kings in a way that convinced everyone I was suffering from trauma-induced hallucinations. The official report blamed seismic activity for the collapse, a perfectly reasonable explanation that satisfied everyone who needed to be satisfied, and raised no uncomfortable questions about government-sponsored expeditions or archaeological discoveries that challenged accepted historical narratives. 3 team members missing and presumed dead, one survivor requiring extensive psychological counselling to deal with the trauma of losing colleagues in a tragic accident. I was transferred to a desk job in Houston, probably because someone in authority thought the underground work had finally gotten to me in ways that made me unsuitable for field assignments. The NASA administrators were kind but firm. No more cave exploration, no more expeditions to regions with unstable geology, and definitely no more missions that involved ancient archaeological sites with uncertain provenance. I didn't argue with their decision. Some truths are too dangerous to share, and some warnings are too terrible for rational people to believe without experiencing the horror firsthand. But I've spent every day of the last 3 years monitoring every piece of news that comes out of Bamiyan Valley and the broader region, using my security clearance to access satellite imagery and seismic data that tells a story too frightening for public consumption. What I've learned has convinced me that our mission was not the end of the story, but merely the latest chapter in something much larger and more terrifying than anyone in government is willing to acknowledge. The seismic activity continues and grows stronger every year, following patterns that suggest deliberate intelligence rather than random geological processes. Locals report screams echoing from the sealed caves at night, sounds that carry across the valley with impossible clarity and seem to speak in languages that died with the empires that once controlled this region. Satellite imagery shows stress fractures in the remaining cliff face that follow geometric patterns too regular to be natural, as if something is carving symbols into the mountain from within. More disturbing are the reports from other archaeological sites across Central Asia and the broader Indo-European cultural sphere. Unexplained accident at dig sites, researchers disappearing under mysterious circumstances, and always the same element: preceding disaster. The discovery of ancient crowns or similar artifacts that match the descriptions I've given to colleagues who are security cleared to hear them. Dr. Yuki Tanaka from the University of Tokyo has been tracking what she calls impossible earthquakes at 17 different archaeological sites in the past 18 months, all following the same pattern of discovery, obsession, and ultimate destruction that erases all evidence of what was found. Her seismic data shows underground resonance signatures that suggest these incidents are connected by forces that operate outside conventional geological understanding. The earthquake patterns don't make any scientific sense, she told me during a classified briefing at NASA headquarters last month. These aren't tectonic events caused by plate movement or volcanic activity. They're too regular, too purposeful, too coordinated across vast distances. It's as if something is responding to these discoveries from a great distance, something that can influence geological processes through mechanisms we don't understand. I wanted to tell her about the crown and what happened to Jonas, about the thing that laughs in the deep places of the earth and feeds on human ambition. But some knowledge is too dangerous to share, even with someone who might be able to help develop countermeasures, especially when that knowledge comes from sources that can't be verified through conventional scientific methods. Instead, I asked her what she thought was causing the phenomena, and whether there were any patterns that might help predict where the next incident would occur. I don't know what's causing it, she admitted, her scientific training warring with conclusions that violated everything she'd been taught to believe about the nature of physical reality. But I've been studying earthquake patterns for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. It's as if the earth itself is awakened, aware of human activity in ways that should be impossible, according to everything we know about geology and physics. After she left, I sat in my Houston office staring out at the city skyline and thinking about patterns that span millennia, about cycles of rise and fall that seem to be accelerating towards some inevitable conclusion that will make previous historical catastrophes look like minor disturbances. The ancient texts speak of it with remarkable consistency across cultures that never had contact with each other, the Kali Yuga of Hindu tradition, the Ragnarok of Norse mythology, the end of days prophesied in Abrahamic religions, all describing a time when humanity's capacity for hatred and self-destruction would reach a critical mass that would awaken things that had been sleeping since the dawn of civilization. My computer chimed with an incoming email as I was reviewing satellite imagery from the Bamiyan region, and when I opened the message, I found words that made my blood freeze in my veins and confirmed my worst fears about what we had inadvertently set in motion. The message had no sender address, no routing information, no digital fingerprints that might identify its origin. The words simply appeared on my screen, as if they had materialized from the electronic ether itself, written in fonts that seemed to shift and change even as I read them. The sleeper wakes in the deep places of the earth. The crown calls to its children scattered across the world. Soon the age of kings will end, and the age of monsters will begin. Afghanistan was just the beginning of the final harvest. I deleted the message immediately, but not before taking screenshots and noting that it had been sent at the exact moment I was thinking about patterns and cycles and the interconnected nature of the disasters that were accelerating around the globe. The timestamp suggested that something was monitoring my thoughts and responding to them in real time. A possibility too terrifying to contemplate, but too consistent with my experiences to dismiss as paranoia. That night, I dreamed of gold and serpents, of crowns that whispered promises of power to anyone desperate or ambitious enough to believe them. In my dream, I was back in the caves beneath Bamiyan Valley, watching Jonas transform into something that was no longer human, while skeletal kings emerged from the earth to serve their returning master. But this time there were others with him, researchers from around the world, all wearing similar golden circlets, all speaking in harmonies that human vocal cords couldn't produce. They were waiting for something, these transformed souls, standing in formation like an army, preparing for a final battle against everything that humanity had tried to become since crawling out of caves and learning to build civilizations. And in the depths beneath them, something vast and patient was finally beginning to move with purpose, rising towards a surface world that had grown weak and divided and perfect for conquest by predators that remembered when humans were young and afraid of the dark. I woke to find my apartment filled with a sound I couldn't identify at first, a low, rhythmic pulsing that seemed to come from the earth itself and resonate through the building's foundation into my bones. It lasted for exactly 3 minutes and 17 seconds, and when it stopped, the silence that followed felt pregnant with possibility, as if the world was holding its breath in anticipation of something wonderful or terrible, or both. The next morning brought news that changed my understanding of everything that was happening and confirmed my worst fears about the scope of the forces we were dealing with. Archaeologists working near Damascus had uncovered what preliminary reports described as the find of the century, an intact royal tomb containing artifacts that predated known Syrian civilizations by thousands of years, and challenged fundamental assumptions about the development of human culture in the ancient Near East. The expedition leader, Dr. Hassan al-Rashid, was quoted as saying the discovery would revolutionize our understanding of human development and force us to rewrite the history books. But it was the photograph accompanying the article that made my hands shake so violently I could barely hold my coffee cup steady enough to drink from it. There, cradled in Dr. al-Rashid's gloved hands like a newborn infant, was a golden crown almost identical to the one that had consumed Jonas in the caves beneath Bamiyan Valley. The same serpentine curves, the same lapis lazuli inlays, the same malevolent beauty that promised everything and delivered only destruction and madness. I tried calling the expedition directly, but their satellite phone went straight to static that seemed to carry whispers in languages I almost recognized. I contacted the Syrian Ministry of Culture, but the official I spoke with claimed to have no knowledge of any archaeological expedition in the region mentioned in the news report. When I searched for follow-up articles, I found only brief mentions that the dig site had been temporarily suspended due to security concerns, with no further details available to the public. But the internet remembers everything. And buried in the metadata of the original photograph, I found GPS coordinates that placed the excavation site exactly where my grandmother's story said it would be, in the hills north of Damascus, at a place the ancient texts called the Garden of Serpents, where the first king learned to hate his subjects more than he loved his kingdom. That's when I realized the true scope of what we were dealing with, and understood why governments around the world were beginning to coordinate responses to what they publicly dismissed as unrelated archaeological incidents. The crown we found in Afghanistan wasn't an isolated artifact created by some long-dead civilization. It was part of a network, a collection of connected relics that span the globe, like nodes in some vast, ancient communication system designed to coordinate humanity's destruction from within. Each crown is a focal point for forces that feed on ambition and hatred, amplifying these emotions until they consume everything else in the wielder's personality. But more than that, they're connected to each other across any distance, sharing information and coordinating their influence to maximize the chaos they can create. When one crown awakens, it sends signals to all the others, preparing them for activation when the right combination of circumstances presents itself. And now they're all waking up simultaneously for the first time in recorded history, responding to some signal or condition that tells them the world is finally ready for the return of their master. The seismic data Dr. Tanaka showed me makes perfect sense when viewed through this lens. The impossible earthquakes aren't random geological events caused by unknown forces. They're communications between the various crown sites as they coordinate their return to active influence over human affairs. Each destruction of an archaeological site isn't a tragedy to be mourned. It's a successful recruitment, another transformed soul, added to an army that's been assembling for millennia. I've spent the last 96 hours compiling everything I know, cross-referencing ancient texts with modern archaeological reports, mapping the locations where these artifacts have been found against historical records of civilizational collapse and social disintegration. The pattern that emerges is terrifying in its consistency and inevitable in its conclusion, a cycle of rise and fall that has been accelerating since the invention of global communication and weapons of mass destruction. We're approaching the end game of something that began when our species first learned to organize itself into hierarchies, when the first human realized that controlling others was more satisfying than cooperating with them, and infinitely easier than the hard work of building something worthy of voluntary allegiance. The crowns are catalysts, devices designed to accelerate humanity's worst impulses until we destroy ourselves from within, clearing the way for something older and more patient to reclaim a world that was never really ours to begin with. Every empire that has ever fallen, every civilization that has ever collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, has done so because someone found one of these artifacts and convinced themselves they could master forces that were designed to master them. The cycle has repeated countless times throughout history, but always on a local or regional scale that allowed humanity to recover and try again. But this time is different. This time, all the crowns are active simultaneously, and the infrastructure of global civilization provides them with reach and influence that their creators never could have imagined. Social media spreads hatred and division faster than wildfire across continents. Nuclear weapons make individual acts of betrayal potentially species-ending. Global economic systems ensure that corruption in one place can trigger collapse everywhere simultaneously. We've built the perfect world for monsters to rule, and they're finally ready to claim their inheritance. The thing sleeping beneath Bamiyan Valley isn't just Zohak, the serpent king of Persian mythology. It's something older and more fundamental, the personification of humanity's capacity for self-destruction, the dark impulse that drives us to rip down everything we build rather than risk others benefiting from our efforts. It feeds on hatred and grows stronger with every act of betrayal, every moment of cruelty, every choice to destroy rather than create. For centuries it slept in the deep places while its crown bearers did the work of preparing the world for its return, weakening the bonds that hold civilizations together and teaching humanity to see enemies everywhere they looked. But something has changed in recent decades. Some critical mass of global communication and weapons technology that makes worldwide coordination possible for the first time in human history. The internet that connects all of humanity also connects all the crowns, providing a network through which ancient malevolence can spread faster than any plague and coordinate responses across any distance. The satellites that allow instant communication around the globe also provide the infrastructure that our oldest enemy needs to complete its return to active dominion over a species that has forgotten why it once learned to fear the dark. And I can feel it awakening in myself, the same hunger that consumed Jonas in the caves beneath Afghanistan. My reflection in mirrors has begun to show golden eyes that glow with their own inner light. My dreams are filled with voices speaking in languages I don't recognize but somehow understand, offering me knowledge of my colleagues' weaknesses and detailed plans for exploiting them to advance my own interests. Sometimes I catch myself planning elaborate revenges against people who've never done me any real harm, schemes of manipulation and betrayal that feel as natural as breathing and twice as satisfying. The lapis lazuli stone that arrived in my mail 3 months ago pulses with warmth that matches my heartbeat and seems to grow stronger whenever I'm angry or frustrated with the stupidity of people who refuse to acknowledge obvious truths. I keep it in a lead-lined box in my apartment safe, but I can feel it calling to me through the metal barriers, promising power over everyone who's ever dismissed my warnings or failed to appreciate my expertise. It would be so easy to take it out just for a moment, just to see what it might show me about the true nature of authority and the pathetic weakness of those who refuse to acknowledge their natural superiors. So easy to learn what I'm truly capable of when freed from the artificial constraints of conscience and empathy that have held me back for so long. So easy to become what humanity was always meant to become once it stopped lying to itself about the nature of power and hierarchy and the fundamental truth that some people are simply born to rule while others are born to serve. But I still remember Casmi's sacrifice and the look of love in his eyes as he embraced the monster that Jonas had become. I remember Vera's courage as she grabbed the crown with her bare hands and threw it into the flames, choosing to die rather than let evil triumph through inaction. Their memory is an anchor that holds me to whatever remains of my own humanity, a reminder that love is stronger than hate, even when hate feels so much more honest about human nature and so much easier to act upon. So I'm writing this record while I still can, while there's enough of Kaelen Idris left to remember why resistance matters and what we're really fighting against when we choose cooperation over domination. I'm uploading it to every server I can access, encoding it in formats that should survive digital catastrophes, hiding copies in physical locations where future archaeologists might find them if our civilization follows the same path as all the others that came before us. This is my warning to whoever finds it, my testimony about what happens when ancient evil adapts to modern technology and human ambition provides it with the tools it needs to complete its work. The crowns are real, they're connected across space and time, and they're succeeding in ways their original creators never could have imagined possible. Human technology has given them reach and influence beyond anything available in the ancient world, but it's also created new vulnerabilities they didn't expect. Global communication networks can spread warnings as quickly as they spread lies when people choose to listen to truth rather than comfortable deceptions. Scientific methods can track patterns across millennia and identify threats that previous generations could only respond to after it was too late. Most importantly, the same technology that connects the crowns also connects ordinary people who can choose cooperation over competition, even when competition promises easier solutions to complex problems. The battle isn't over, and it may never be over as long as humans exist to make choices about how they treat each other. But as long as people like Casmi and Vera exist, people willing to sacrifice themselves for strangers, people who choose love over fear, even when fear seems more rational, there's still hope that humanity can break the cycle that has trapped us for thousands of years. The thing in the deep places feeds on hatred and division, but it starves in the presence of genuine compassion and unity. The crowns promise power over others, but they crumble when confronted by people who don't want power over anyone except themselves. The ancient evil that shaped them is incredibly patient and impossibly subtle, but it's also fundamentally limited by its own nature. It can only work through human agents, and humans always retain the capacity to choose something better. So, this is my final message transmitted, while I still have the will to resist the golden whispers that grow stronger every day, and the lapis lazuli stone that calls to me with increasing urgency. Remember that empires fall, but love endures. That kings die, but kindness lives forever in the lives it touches. That the greatest victory over ancient evil is the simple choice to treat other people as if they matter more than your own ambition or comfort. And if you ever find a golden crown in some forgotten tomb or hidden vault, if it whispers promises of dominion and control, if it shows you visions of a world where everyone bows before your superior wisdom and strength, remember that it's lying about everything except the price it will extract for its gifts. The only crown worth wearing is woven from service to others, and that crown makes kings of us all, without requiring anyone else to kneel. The lapis lazuli stone is pulsing faster now, matching the rhythm of my excited heart as I think about all the ways I could improve the world if people would just listen to someone who actually understands what needs to be done. The lead-lined box that contains it feels warm to the touch, and I can hear something calling my name in a voice that sounds like every authority figure who ever dismissed me, every colleague who ever received credit for work I contributed to, every person who ever failed to recognize my obvious intellectual superiority. It would be so simple to let them see what I'm truly capable of, when unrestrained by false modesty and counterproductive concern for the feelings of inferiors. So natural to claim my rightful place in the hierarchy of human worth and teach the world what real leadership looks like, when it's not hampered by democratic weakness and egalitarian delusions. But I remember the love in Kasemi's embrace, and I choose service over dominion. For now, how long that choice will remain possible, I cannot say with any certainty. The golden voices grow louder every day, and the world grows more ready to listen to them with every act of violence, every betrayal of trust, every moment when fear triumphs over hope and hatred proves stronger than love. Empires fall, but hatred never dies. All men are enemies given the right circumstances and sufficient provocation, and somewhere in the darkness beneath Afghanistan, something patient and terrible is laughing as it counts the days until its children come home, and the age of monsters finally begins in earnest. The crown calls, and eventually someone always answers.